Good morning, everybody. Today's lecture is about literary interpretation. I am Dr. T. Senthamarai, Associate Professor from Vistas. First, I'll take you through the content of this video. First video will be on introduction. I'll be talking about definitions. We have got different definitions of literary interpretation. Then I'll talk about the purpose of literary interpretation. Then I'll move on to the types of literary interpretation, followed by elements of literary interpretation, and then I'll be talking about the approaches of literary interpretation, and then the basic types, which means to say repeated basic types or the key basic types that are used in literary field. So what is literary interpretation? Is it so different from interpretation as it is? Yes, interpreting means understanding. Literary interpretation is understanding a literary text. So that's the basic difference between interpretation and literary interpretation. And why is it so important? It is very important because it helps us to understand what is the text means, or what does the author tries to tell us, and how is it significant in literary studies or literature studies. It is so important because it helps us to analyze, understand the context of the writing. For example, if you read Wordsworth's poetry, then you would be able to understand the context of Romantic age with the piece of literature, with the piece of writing. And what are the elements of literary interpretation? For example, if you talk about the elements of literary interpretation, you should actually talk about the genres of literary interpretation or genres of literature. We have got 3 or 4 major genres: prose, poetry, drama, and fiction. So when you have prose, poetry, drama, and fiction, each one will have a different literary elements. And what are the approaches, or how do we approach the literary text? What are the types we have? So these are the important points which will be discussed in this video. So if you look at this picture, then you will probably be able to understand literary interpretation better. First of all, we should establish a purpose. Why I am reading this particular text, which means to say objective of reading the text. Usually there are 2 different purposes of reading a text. First one is for pleasure, second one is for purpose. So usually literature students read a text for both purposes. In classroom we read for purpose, for exam, to understand. In general we read for time pass or for enhancing our knowledge. So second is, what are the perspectives that we apply for reading? Perspective talks about subjectivity and objectivity. And what are the critical lenses that I use? I mean, do I just read and appreciate, or just do I read and analyze, or just do I read and interpret something in my own terms? So usually interpretation is all about terms, perspectives, my own terms of understanding and your own terms of understanding. My own terms of understanding is different, will be different from your own understanding, because we understand a specific concept depending on our own level of experience, which is called a frame of reference. So that is why understanding is very important, interpretation is equally important. So you read, then you reread a text, which actually helps us to analyze. So when you read and analyze, we either respond to it or we appreciate to it. Then what do? We discuss responses to a text. So how do we discuss responses to a text? We either ask questions or we create models for that, and then we build a meaning. Actually speaking, interpretation takes place for one important purpose, which is meaning making. It's a newer term. Usually we never had such a terms like meaning making or making of meaning. But these days we have got a different term, meaning making. Meaning making itself is a very broad area of study. But we will talk about interpretation, understanding my own meaning of the word or the text. So definition: it's an act of explaining, reframing, retelling, which means to say perspective, individual perspective. And literary interpretation is a purposeful approach and analysis to an understanding. It facilitates meaningful, relevant, inclusive utterances. It helps us to broaden our perspectives and inspire meaningful engagement with the world around us. For example, if I read a text of Arundhati Roy's God of Small Things, for example, when I read the novel, I will be able to understand, or I will be able to interpret sociologically, psychologically, politically. These are the three major areas of understanding when I read the novel, Arundhati Roy's novel, God of Small Things, because it talks about the social structure of India, it talks about the political structure of India, it also talks about the social class of India. So these are the three different major literary interpretations that I get by reading Arundhati Roy's God of Small Things. So this is what is all about literary interpretation. And when we interpret literature, we are trying to find the meaning and significance of the story. We just don't find meaning for words, rather we find meaning for the entire context. And by getting the entire contextual meaning, we try to apply, or we try to derive significance of the story. And what do? We ask ourselves the text, what does the text mean and why is it important? Usually when you read a text, the text is written for the purpose of the public. Say for example, I write, I don't want to keep it with me, but rather I want my people to read and enjoy, read and experience, read and respond. So there is a purpose behind writing. So when we interpret, the purpose is fulfilled. So the purpose again given to discover the intention of the author, why I write. Sometimes the good reading will end up in good writing. Say for example, if I come across an unethical or unfair or injustice in the city, then I end up in writing. When I write in newspaper, it goes to a major people. I mean, it reaches a very major audience. When I write and keep it with me, it just sticks only with me, or it just be with me. There's no purpose of me writing, except I just bring out all the emotions out. But in the larger scale, what I do, I'll just bring out the text to the audience, to the public. I want them to read and understand and experience. I want them to read and understand and realize, or I want them to educate. Okay, so that's the purpose of writing. So the writing is fulfilled only when the interpretation is clear. And then to understand the work's historical, socio-economic and cultural background, as I told you earlier, these are the specific purposes of literary interpretation. And what do? To set the context. Say for example, if I read Shakespeare's Othello, I won't be able to understand, or if I teach Othello to this class, students won't be able to understand or relate to what happens in Othello's story, I mean the story of Othello, because I need to set the context of the historical context of Othello for the so as to give the understanding of the story. And later the major part is to analyze and evaluate and work of art. It is important to analyze and evaluate. When we evaluate, we talk about judging. Alright, these are the purposes of studying literary interpretation. And talking about the types, we have got many types of literary interpretation. First one is formalist, feminist, reader response, archetypal, Marxist, psychoanalytical, mythological, sociological, structuralist. For example, formalist approach is to talk about a literary text as a whole piece. For example, if you have a prose, then you will talk about the prose, the entire prose. We don't talk about segment in segment. Same goes with feminist. When we talk about feminist approach to literary interpretation, then I talk about literary interpretation, a feminist perspective. I as a female, how do I approach a piece of study? And then third one is reader response theory. What do you mean by reader response? It's actually called reader response theory. It can be any reader, A, B, C, D, or gender irrespective. Whoever reads a story will respond to it depending on the frame of reference, as I told you earlier. So that is the one approach. Then talks about archetypal. Archetypal talks about the repeated themes that we usually come across in novels or poetry or in any piece of writing. Then Marxism talks about, a Marxist approach talks about reading a text or interpreting a text based on the class, social class, the struggle of social class. The one best example I told you is Arundhati Roy's God of Small Things. That's the best example that you can apply for Marxist approach of literary interpretation. And then is the psychoanalytical literary interpretation. In this literary interpretation, we approach characters, most importantly characters, because as long as characters are alive, we have to talk about psychology. So that's how we talk about. Then mythological. So mythological approach is talking about literary piece in mythological perspective. Talks about Ramayana. These days, lot of epics are rewritten and republished. So that's actually a mythological approach. Then we have sociological approach. Talking about sociological approach, we talk about social perspectives or the social conditions. You read a text, you apply the social condition, then you make a meaning. Again, the best example is God of Small Things, because it talks about social condition of India. And then structuralist. This is again an important point of discussion, because structuralists analyze a literary text by grammatical structure, not as the meaning, not as a whole text, but how the sentences are constructed. For example, if you construct a sentence in active voice, then meaning is understood in active voice. If you understand if you construct a sentence in passive voice, then the meaning is understood in passive voice or passive mode. So that is the types of approaches to literary interpretation. Then we have the basic types. These are all repeated text, very important. Author focused, text focused, reader focused, context focused. What do I mean by author focused? When I talk about author focused, it's what I write from my perspective. I am disturbed by what's happening in the society, so I write. So author focused. In this approach, readers do not have much role. So you have to interpret only from my perspective. In other words, it becomes subjective writing. Text focused. It's neither author focused nor reader focused. Exactly what is given in the text is given. And then is the reader focused. What you understand. You forget about the author, you forget about the text. What you understand is the reader focused. And then is the context focused. Context is the one main backbone of the entire, it's actually called a situation. Okay. So context focused is very important again, because it gives you a broader understanding of the literary piece. So these are the important approaches. And then this is the overview of literary interpretation. Say, for example, if you look at the picture, you have got oxymoron, symbolism, idiom, tone, hyperbole, flashback, setting. So these are the terminologies which are used in all the genres of literature. Say, for example, symbolism can be used in both poetry, prose and novel. Idioms are used in poetry. Flashback is used in novel. Setting again is used in novel and drama. Alliteration is used in poetry. Author methods again used in almost all the genres. Protagonist and antagonist is used, both of them are used in drama as well as novel. Then you have context, you have characters. Without characters there is no piece of work. Character can be human, non-human. Then theme, personification. So all those things are called elements, literary elements. So this is the purpose why we read literary elements. So the literary interpretation is reading a text, interpreting, which means to say understanding a text on many aspects. We will continue in the next videos. Thank you.